In 1887, deep in the Mississippi Delta, a town appeared that didn't exist on any official map. There were no plantation owners, no overseers, no white landowners at all. Every person who lived there had once been enslaved. They had bought the land themselves, built their own homes, opened their own schools, churches, and businesses. For the first time in their lives, they were completely free. And for a while, the town thrived. But within just a few decades, something began to change. Businesses closed, families disappeared, houses were left empty. By the early 1900s, the town that had once symbolized freedom was slowly fading away. There was no natural disaster, no official investigation, no national headlines. And today, the question remains, how did a town built entirely by freed slaves almost disappear from history? Before we continue, if stories like this matter to you, the forgotten places, the hidden history, the lives that were never fully recorded, take a moment to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to uncovering real stories that history almost erased. And I'd like to know something from you. Which city are you watching from? Write it in the comments. I read every one.
Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't in books, they're in the places where you live. If your town, your community, or your family has a real historical story that deserves to be told, you can send it to maheshusa65@gmail.com. Include your name and the location. If the story fits this channel, I may turn it into a full documentary. Because some histories were forgotten, but they shouldn't stay that way. Now let's go back to Mississippi, 1887. The town was called Mound Bayou. It was founded in 1887 by two men, Isaiah Montgomery and Benjamin Green. Both had been born into slavery.
And both had grown up on one of the largest plantations in Mississippi. After the Civil War ended in 1865, freedom came suddenly, but stability did not. Across the South, newly freed families faced a different kind of control. Sharecropping contracts kept many in debt, violence and intimidation were common, and in many towns, black residents had little protection under the law. Opportunities were limited, ownership was rare, true independence was almost impossible. Montgomery believed there was only one solution. If freedom was going to survive, it needed its own place. So in the late 1880s, he and Green purchased thousands of acres of undeveloped land in the Mississippi Delta. It was swampy, isolated, covered in thick brush and standing water. Most people saw it as useless. But to them, it was a chance to start over. Families began arriving by wagon, by foot, and by river. There were no roads, no buildings, no electricity. Everything had to be built from the ground up. Homes were constructed by hand. Land was cleared acre by acre. Crops were planted where swamp and wilderness once stood. And slowly, something remarkable began to take shape. Mound Bayou became one of the first self-governed black communities in the United States. The town had its own mayor, its own police, its own schools, churches, and businesses. There were doctors, teachers, bankers, shop owners. For many residents, it was the first time in their lives that they owned property. The first time they voted without fear. The first time they lived in a place where their future was truly their own. By the early 1900s, Mound Bayou was growing. Visitors described it as organized, peaceful, and prosperous. Some even called it a symbol of what freedom could look like. But outside the town's borders, the South was changing. New laws were being passed. New systems of control were forming.
and the independence that made Mound Bayou strong was about to make it vulnerable. At first, the town grew quietly. Families built small wooden homes by hand. A church was raised from salvaged lumber. A school opened inside a single-room structure where children learned to read, many of them the first in their families to ever hold a book. They named the place New Hope. But something about the town made outsiders uneasy. There were no white landowners, no overseers, no plantation accounts. Land records were incomplete. And that's where the mystery begins.
In 1892, a county tax officer arrived to officially register the settlement. He stayed for less than a day. His report, filed weeks later, contained only one unusual note: residents cooperative, but unwilling to provide original land documents. There were deeds, but many were copies. Some were handwritten, others had no county seal at all. Legally, the town shouldn't have existed. Then came the first incident. A railroad survey team attempted to map a new line through the area. When they returned, they reported something strange.
The town wasn't where the previous map showed it. Not moved, not gone, just misrecorded. Coordinates didn't match. Distances were wrong. The survey was redone twice. Each time, the measurements came back slightly different. One engineer later wrote, "Either our instruments failed, or the town did not want to be measured." But the real tension began in the late 1890s. Neighboring plantation owners started filing complaints. They claimed workers were leaving without notice. Families were disappearing overnight.
No contracts broken, no disputes filed. They were simply gone. And weeks later, someone would hear they were living in New Hope, working their own land, earning their own money, sending their children to school. For the first time in generations, independent. By 1901, the population had tripled. A general store opened, a blacksmith shop, even a small cooperative farm where families shared tools and harvests. But with growth came attention, and attention brought pressure. Banks began rejecting loan requests from residents. Supply wagons reported being turned away from nearby towns. And then, one night, a warning was delivered. No signature, no return address, just a single line. Land without permission does not stay free.
Within months, something began to change. Families stopped expanding their homes. Some buildings were quietly dismantled. Records stopped being kept. And when a journalist visited in 1905 to write about the Freedom Town, several residents told him the same thing. "We built this place to live quietly, not to be seen." Because by then, people in New Hope were starting to understand something. The town had survived slavery, but freedom was attracting the kind of attention that could make a place disappear. By 1908, the pressure around New Hope was no longer quiet. It became organized. Land agents began arriving with official-looking documents. They claimed portions of the town had been improperly registered. Some said the land technically belonged to old plantation estates. Others claimed taxes had never been fully paid. Most residents couldn't afford lawyers. And many of the original land papers had never been recognized by the county in the first place. The same loophole that allowed New Hope to exist was now being used to take it away. Then came the intimidation. Supply deliveries were delayed. Credit accounts were suddenly canceled. Merchants in nearby towns refused to sell tools, lumber, or seed. One farmer later wrote in a letter, "They cannot chain us anymore, so they are starving the land instead." But the worst came at night. Witness accounts, collected years later, describe men on horseback riding along the edges of the settlement. No names, no uniforms,
just shadows. Fences were cut. Livestock disappeared. A barn was burned, though no investigation was ever opened. And every time residents tried to report the incidents, the response was the same. There was no official evidence. By 1912, families began making quiet decisions. Some sold their land for far less than its value. Some left without selling at all. Others simply packed what they could carry and disappeared north. But the most painful part wasn't the leaving. It was the silence. No protests, no newspaper headlines, no court battles. Because many residents believed something simple and frightening. If they made noise, the pressure would become violence. Church attendance began to shrink. The school closed after its teacher left for Chicago. The cooperative farm stopped meeting. And one by one, homes were dismantled. Not destroyed, but carefully taken apart so the lumber could be reused somewhere else. As if the town was being erased, piece by piece. In 1918, a traveling census worker visited the area. His notes contained a single line. Settlement formerly occupied by colored landholders. Most structures abandoned. Residents relocated. No explanation. No cause. Just gone. Within 30 years of its founding, New Hope had almost disappeared. Not destroyed by a single event, not wiped out by a disaster, but pushed, pressured, isolated, and quietly removed, until freedom itself became too expensive to keep. And what remained was land. Empty land, with almost no official record that a town had ever been there at all. By the early 1920s, New Hope no longer appeared on county maps. Where homes once stood, there were only open fields. The church foundation remained, cracked and covered with grass. The schoolhouse was gone. The farms had been absorbed into larger properties. Officially, the town had not been destroyed. It had simply ceased to exist. But the people of New Hope did not disappear. They carried the town with them. Families moved north to cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and Detroit. Some found factory work. Some never owned land again. And many of them told their children something important. Once, we had our own town. But over time, even those stories began to fade, because there were no photographs, no newspapers, no official recognition, just memories. And memories don't survive forever. In 1936, a Federal Records Survey team documented abandoned black settlements across the South. One entry mentioned the area where New Hope once stood. The description was brief. Former independent Negro farming community. Residents displaced over time due to land disputes and economic pressure. No names, no dates, no explanation of how a town built by freedom was quietly erased. Today, if you visit the location, you won't find a sign. No historical marker, no memorial, just farmland. And if you didn't know what happened there, you would never know a community once lived, worked, worshipped, and dreamed on that land. But this is the part history rarely records. New Hope was not a failure. For nearly 30 years, men and women who had once been treated as property owned land, built homes, ran businesses, educated their children. They created something slavery was never supposed to allow: independence. And even though the town disappeared, the idea did not, because many of the families who left New Hope became part of the Great Migration, the movement that reshaped America's cities, culture, and future. In that way, the town didn't die, it spread. And maybe that's why its story was never preserved, because some histories are not erased by accident, they are erased quietly, until the land forgets, until the records disappear, until the only evidence left is silence.
And maybe the real mystery isn't why New Hope vanished. Maybe the real mystery is how many towns like it were never written down at all. Some communities disappear from maps, but not from history. And sometimes, the strongest acts of freedom are the ones the world tried hardest to forget.